Hashem, Boker Tov. Today's Daf Yomi is Menachos Daf Samoch. We're going to start on the bottom of Nun Tesima base 59b, 5 lines from the bottom. We're talking about the prohibition from the Torah to put on shem and oil or lavona or this frankincense spice on the korban mincha of a sinner. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Nasa Mashu Shemen. When have you disqualified the mincha of the thinner? If you put even a drop of oil, but it has to be on an olive-sized amount of the mincha. My timer, what's the reason? Because it says in the pasuk, "Will yasim aleha shemen," that you're not allowed. Will yasim aleha shemen? You're not allowed to place, and the word sima means a drop. Sima means koldahu, any amount. But aleha, will yasimu aleha, and aleha, it means adi ikashira. There has to be a minimum amount, which is an olive size. 2 lines from the bottom on 59b. Amar the Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef and Rav Yochanan. But when it comes to the lavona, when do you disqualify it? Nothing kazayis lavona al gabi mashu mincha pasul. That if you put an olive-sized amount of the lavona on just a drop of the mincha, then it's disqualified. My timer, because by the lavona it says lo yitain aleha livona. The lo yitain aleha livona, you're not allowed to be yitain, and yitain means an amount. Adika nesino, a placing, a giving, that's a full amount. And then it says aleha, but then at the end it says aleha, which last time we said means the kedayis, but this time what we say on top of samach hamad aleph, it's a riboy achar riboy. It's an expansion after an expansion. And the first expansion was nasan. So now we have another expansion, and we say it's a double positive, which is a negative. Riboy achar riboy elamai. So when you ever have an expansion after an expansion, it's to diminish. The Ika Da'amri, alternative version of this discussion is Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef, by Rabbi Yochanan, Nasan Mashu Shemen, Agabe Kezayis Mincha. Let's say you put just a drop of oil on an olive-sized amount of the korban mincha, Mahu. What will be the halacha there? Do we say Mi Ba'inan Si'ima Kinesina? Let's say does it need to be a full amount, Olo or not? And the Gemara says, take it. According to the second version, the Gemara leaves this question unresolved. So then the Gemara now says, Nasan Shemen al Shirah, that you're allowed to put the oil, mix it with the Shirayim of the, then you're not in violation of the prohibition. You're not allowed to put any oil on the mincha of the sinner. V'lo yitain. And then it says you're not allowed to put the lavona. Yachol b'shnei kohanim. I might have understood this to mean that when does this prohibition apply? That only Rashi says the lo yislaivu shnei lavin. You're not liable for two prohibitions for putting the oil and the lavona, unless there are two kohanim that do it. One kohen puts the oil, and the other one does the lavona. But one kohen who does it himself, then he'll only be liable for one prohibition. I might have thought that one kohen, even if he does both, is liable for one, but you need two kohanim to be liable for two prohibitions. I might have thought that. Talmud Omar, the pasuk says, Aleha, begufa shel mincha akasim medaber. The Torah is only referring to the mincha. We don't care who does it. V'lo b'kohen, meaning to say it's on the object that you're making, not on the one who's doing it. So therefore, if it's one kohen who does it, he's liable for both. I might think, as our Mishnah said, you can't put the oil in a utensil, and then even if you just put that utensil into the utensil which has the mincha, and they're not actually touching, it's disqualified. It's prohibited when it goes into the gufa of the mincha, when it's basically into the oil itself. Rashi says, no, it's mixed up together with it. It's got to be mixed up. Now we're up to the next Inyan, on the next Mishnah, which talks about Hagasha and Tenufa. Tenufa is the waving. We'll deal with that really in the next Mishnah after this Mishnah. But now we're talking about the Hagasha. The Hagasha is the concept that before you take the scoop from the korban mincha called the kamitza, the Kohen was supposed to bring the. Well, we assume it's a Kohen because how else are you going to get it to the mizbeach? So the Kohen brings the mincha to the southwest corner and touches the mincha to the southwest corner of the altar, and then the kamitza is done. And some Hasidic rabbis had this practice on challah, with their challah on Shabbos, that before they cut the challah, which is like a sacred act, they would touch the challah to the table to remind us of this action of hagasha that was done in the time of the Beis Hamikdash. So yesh tu'unas hagasha. There are some karbanos that require hagasha, ve'ein tu'unas tenufa, and they don't require tenufa. That's where the kohen and the owner of the karban wave it together. You have to wait for Samach Beis to understand the laws of Tenufa. Hagasha, there are some who require Hagasha, but no Tenufa. There are some that require Hagasha Tenufa. There are some that require Tenufa below Hagasha. And then there are some that are saying, no, low Tenufa below Hagasha. Okay, so now let's go into Ve'elu Tu'unas Hagasha, Ve'en Tu'unas Tenufa. These are the ones that require Hagasha, but do not require the waving. What are the ones that require the hagasha? The minchas hastoas. If you say a stam mincha, flour. Machavas, the flat pan. Marchashes, the deep pan. Vachaos, the varakikin. Minchas kohanim also requires hagasha. The minchas kohen Mashiach. The minchas nachan, the minchas of the idolater. The minchas nashim of the women. Minchas chote, and the mincha of the sinner. All these require hagasha. Rabbi Shimon Omer. Rabbi Shimon's position is that the mincha of the Kohanim and the mincha of Kohen Mashiach, Ema and Hagasha. Rabbi Shimon's position is that the mincha of the Kohanim and the mincha of the Kohen Mashiach do not require Hagasha, but fisha ein bahen kamitza. So that they do not have a kamitza; they're entirely burnt. The minchas of the Kohanim and the minchas Kohen Mashiach, and so since they don't require kamitza, he says v'kol she'ein bahen kamitza, ein bahen Hagasha. Anything that doesn't have kamitza does not have hagasha, and the Gemara is going to get into this on Samachal from Menachos. So anyway, before we get there, we go through the Gemara. Amar Papa Kohecha de Tanan Asatanan. Well, we had this on yesterday's stuff, and Rashi gave two explanations, and we, adopted or whatever. Who are we to choose which one of Rashi is better? But it was easier for us to explain. That it means that when you have when you bring a mincha, you have to bring 10 loaves of either chalos or rakikin, but you can't bring half of them chalos and half rakikin. My kamash, one was that teaching us Rabbi Shimon to exclude the position of Rabbi Shimon, who says mechza chalos and mechza rakikin. Yeah, he says you should bring half chalos and half rakikin. So we're excluding that position. You have to be either, if you say minchas mafe, it has to be either all chalos or all rakikin. Kamash Montelo, that we're not saying like Rabbi Shimon. So now the Gemara asks the question, Minah Hani Mili, from where do we know this? That these are the karbanos that require hagasha. So where do we know this? The Tana Rabbanan. That what is the source that these menachos require the hagasha, to bring it to touch the southwest corner of the altar before the kamitza, because it's based upon the pasuk. It says with respect to the mincha of the marchashes, it says ve'vesas mincha asher yaseh me'eleh ba'Hashem. You shall bring ve'kriva al kohen ve'gisha al mizbeach. You should bring this mincha that you've done. You should bring the mincha that you've done from these. V'kriva al kohen, bring it to the kohen. V'gisha al mizbeach. So now we'll analyze this. If it said ve'vesa asher yaseh me'elo Hashem v'kriva el kohen v'gisha, if it had said without the word mincha, esa mincha, just said ve'vesa asher yaseh, ayiti omer ein li sheton hagasha ela kometz bavad. I would have said the only thing that requires that hagasha is the kometz, but here it says mincha el kometz bavad. Mincha minayin. How do we know that the whole mincha requires it? Tamal Omar, es mincha. Ve saw es mincha. Says you should bring the mincha. Minchas chote minayin. How do we know that not only that, but also the mincha of a sinner also requires hagasha? Tam Omar es tam mincha, from the word es. So the Gemara says, why do we need to learn this out from a pasuk? Isn't it logical kavachomer? Dinu nemar hacha. It says over here minchas chova. Here it says the obligatory mincha, which is the mincha of the sinner. Nemar hacha, and it says over here minchas nidava. It says that there's a voluntary mincha. Ma minchas nidava netu'una agasha, just like the voluntary mincha requires agasha. Obviously, af minchas chova tu'una agasha. Also the sota, also the sinner's mincha should require agasha. So the Gemara says, no, you can't bring that argument. Why? Mala minchas nidava shekain tu'una shemen v'lavona. Mincha nidava requires also oil and lavona, which the mincha of the sinner does not. So the Gemara says, well, mincha sota tochiach. Well, the mincha sota should prove that the mincha of the sinner requires agasha, because the mincha of the sota does have agasha, and that does not have oil and lavona. The Gemara says, no, mala mincha sota shekain tuna tenufa. The mincha of the sota requires waving, but the mincha of the chote does not. So you can't prove it for kal v'chomer from the sota. The minchas nadav tochiach. The chazer adin lo rizek rizeh lo rizek rizeh. So you go to the common denominator. Atzad shavu shaben sheshavu kmitza v'shavu agasha. The common denominator is they both require kmitza. Both the mincha of the nadava and the sota require kmitza, and they both require agasha. Afani minchas chote. I'll also include the mincha of the sinner. Sheshavu and kmitza. Like them, it requires kmitza, and tishavu and agasha. So it should also require agasha. Where it says, no, malat tzad hashava sheben shekein huchshru lavo ba'ashir keba'ani. Tomer b'minchas chote shel huchshru lavo ba'ashir keba'ani. So the Gemara says, no, you can't bring a kavachomer from the common denominator of the mincha of the nedava and the mincha of the sota, because they have something that the mincha of the sinner doesn't have. And what is that? They have the idea that both the mincha and the dam and the sota, they can also be brought by a rich person. And maybe that's why there's agasha. But the mincha and the sinner is only brought, it's a carbon only vayorid, it's only brought if the person has no money. And so therefore, you can't prove a kavachomer from that to the mincha of the sinner. And so therefore, we need the pasuk Tam Omer es mincha to teach us that the mincha of the sinner requires agasha. Rabbi Shimon learns out the din of agashas omer not from the mincha of, but he learns it out from the case of a sota. He's not arguing to Tanakama, but since we learned the agasha by the mincha of a sinner, Rabbi Shimon also learns out that mincha of the omer and mincha of the sona should require agasha. That's what Rashi says. Dibra maskil. V'chein. So v'chein he omer b'mincha sota. Rashi says Rabbi Shimon v'Tanakama lo puigi. They're not arguing; just they derive it from different verses. So how do we know that these menachos require agasha according to Rabbi Shimon? Rabbi Shimon says ve'vesa. It says in the pasuk ve'vesa asa mincha. What do we learn from that? L'rabos minchas ha'omer agasha. That's coming to teach us that the mincha of the omer requires agasha. V'cheinu omer, because it says the word ve'veisem es omer ishis k'tirchem el hakohen. And so it says, since it says the word ve'veisem and ve'veisa, that's Xer Shava to teach us that the omer requires agasha. And then the next part, then the part of the pasuk continues and it says v'kriva kohen. That's the rabos mincha sota agasha. That's to tell us not only does the omer require agasha, but also the sota's mincha requires agasha. V'cheinu omer, because it says by the sota woman, the kriva usa el hamazbeach. It says he brings it to the altar. Vidin. So why do we need a pasuk to tell us about the sota? Vidinhu. Isn't it logical? Ma mincha chota she'ena tenufa tuna agasha. If the mincha is the chota doesn't require waving, but does require agasha. The mincha sota Shetuuna tenufa, eino din shetuna agasha. For sure, the mincha of the sota, which requires waving, for sure it should require agasha. Where it says, no, you can't bring a kavachomer from the chota. Why? Mala minchas chota shekaim ba'achitin. The mincha of the sinner comes from the wheat, and the mincha of the sota comes from the barley. So go back. Minchas omer tochiach. We'll prove from the minchas omer that's from barley, and that requires agasha. But you can prove from the minchas omer to the sota. Mal minchas omer shekain tuna shem and levona, because that is shem and levona, and the sotas doesn't. Mar says, well, minchas chota tochiach, but the minchas chota, you can prove it from because that comes from the wheat. So chazar adin lo rizeh krizeh lo rizeh krizeh. What's the tada shava shaben? What's the common denominator? Sheshavel kmitza v'shavel agasha. All three require kmitza and agasha, and so therefore we learn from the mincha of the sinner, from the sota and the omer, that it requires agasha. Afani avim mincha sota sheshavta l'kmitza teshav and lagasha. So too, I'll bring the mincha of the sota from the mincha of the sinner, and the mincha of the omer, that it's the same for them, that just like it as a kmitza, it also has a gasha. The Gemara says, yeah, but mala atzad esava sheben shal lo hochshru levo kemach tomar b'mincha sota shal hochshru levo kemach. There's soas, which is fine flour, and kemach is the flour with the bran. So the mincha sota and the omer, they have to come from fine flour called soas, and not from kemach, which is with the bran, and they have a gasha. Are you going to say this? You can't say the kavachomer from them to the sota, which comes from the bran. So therefore, we need a pasuk tamulomar veikriva. So Rabbi Shimon learns out from the pasuk that the sota also, mincha the sota also requires a gasha. Rabbi Yehuda comes along and has a different source. Comes along Rabbi Yehuda Omer Vei. So when it says in the pasuk Vei, so that's the Rabbos Minchas Soto Agasha. Rabbi Shimon said that was the Rabbos the Minchas Omer. Rabbi Yehuda says it's to tell us the Minchas Soto requires Agasha. V'cheini Omer Vei es Karbana Aleha. It says, and he should bring the carbon up. Vehevi es Karbana Aleha. So the pasuk says Vehevi es Karbana Aleha, which talks about the milch of the sota. The milch of the omer does not need a pasuk that requires agasha. My time, a medina kasya, because we learn it out from the kavachomer. Rabbi Yehuda does learn out milch omer from the kavachomer, unlike Rabbi Shimon. Because ma minchas chota, just like the mincha of the sinner, she'ina tuna tenufa tuna agasha, the mincha of the sinner which doesn't require waving requires agasha. Minchas omer she'tuna tenufa. The omer's korban does require tenufa. Eno din tuna agasha. For sure, it should require agasha. Where it says you can't prove it out from there. Mal minchas chota she'kein ba'achitin. The mincha of the sinner comes from the wheat, and the mincha of the omer comes from barley, and wheat is better than barley. So you can't prove that it requires agasha from the mincha of the sinner. So we prove the omer from the mincha sota, which is also barley tochiach. But you can't prove it. Mal mincha sota shekem ba levar avon. It's coming to teach us, clarify a sin, which is not what the mincha omer is coming to teach us. So the maskeros avoni. So the says, well, mincha sota tochiach. Chazar din lo rizek rizeh lo rizek rizeh. So we learn it from the common denominator of the sota and the sinner. They both require kmitza and agasha. So therefore, in minchas omer, that requires both kmitza and agasha. So the Gemara asked the question, Umay parachta. The Gemara asked the question, why does Rabbi Shimon not accept this kavachomer of Rabbi Yehuda? Remember, Rabbi Shimon says ve'veisas to teach us about the mincha of the mincha of the omer. Why doesn't he learn from a kavachomer from sota and sinner like Rabbi Yehuda did? Umay parachta. So Rabbi Shimon parachachi. Rabbi Shimon was bothered by the following: Mal tzad shaben shekain mitzuyin, that you cannot learn from a kal v'chomer, from Sota and Sinner to the Omer because they're more common. Because it could happen several times a year that you have the mincha of the Sinner and the mincha of the Sota. Whereas the mincha of the Omer only can potentially only come once a year. Rabbi Yehuda says, Adarabba, just the opposite. Amitzuya Tfei. Just the opposite. He's optimistic. There won't be any Sota. There won't be any sinners. So the Omer is more common. Because you can maybe never even have a sota or a sinner's mincha. Oh, so now the Gemara says, how do we know Ve'evesa is coming to teach us the law of Hagasha specifically? Maybe it's teaching us something else. So Eino Omer Ve'evesa, maybe mincha cheres chutz mi'ela shebinyan. Maybe the word Ve'evesa has nothing to do with Hagasha. Maybe it's teaching us an individual can bring another mincha that's not listed. Maybe you could bring it from barley, like that is totally different from the other ones that are listed here. That's what Rashi says. Maybe Lola mincha sota, Lola omer, elomar v'larabo sheyacham esnadev mincha charash ina me'in elu. Hey Menachos, omer b'parasha. Soas, the five are the soas, machavas, the merchashes, the mafe, which is the chalas and the rakikin. All of these are wheat, Rashi says. The soas chlitim v'kasi ve'vesa. Maybe it's coming to teach us that you could bring it from the barley. L'rabos misnadev menas the oren. And then Rashi, as a kal v'chomer, but not in our printer Rashi, in the Agos, Gemara says, and it quotes a text which is now in our Gemara. V'dinu tzibur, and we would think that it should be logical. Tzibur maybe vincha menachitin, tzibur maybe mincha menachitin chov. But the community brings obligatory offering from the wheat, i.e., the shtei lechem. Maybe mincha menasoren chov, and the obligatory offering from the barley, which is the Omer. Av yachad maybe mincha menachitin nedava. So too the individual brings in a voluntary mincha from wheat. Yavi mincha menasoren nedava. You should be able to bring a mincha from the barley voluntarily. Tamal Omer elah. So the pasuk says, "Asher yaseh me elah." Elash only ela elah. Only these five. The five are the machavas, the soas, machavas, mercheshes, chalas, rakikin. So oeno Omer elah. Elomar, Hare Elai Mincha. Well, maybe the word Elah is coming to teach us that if a person just says Hare Elai Mincha without specifying Shemevi Chamishi son, that he brings from any of these five. How do we know that he also cannot bring a voluntary mincha from barley? Talmud Omar Mei Elah. Ratz Achas maybe Ratzi Chamisha son maybe. That he can only bring it from these five types. And he cannot bring a mincha nedava from barley. Rabbi Shimon Omer, so now the Gemara says, other drashas of Rabbi Shimon with respect to Agasha. Rabbi Shimon says, Ve'vesa samincha l'rabos shar menachos. That Rabbi Shimon says, it says, Ve'vesa samincha l'rabos shar menachos. For Hagasha. Could go minchas nachre, minchas nashem l'Hagasha. The idolaters and the woman's mincha also require agasha. Yachol shani marba shtei lechem lechem. Rishon says, I might think that the 2 loaves of bread on Shavuos and the lechem aponim should also require agasha. Tamor mei elah. So the Gemara says, Ma ra'iso rabo shar menachos oloti shtei lechem lechem aponim. Why are you saying all the other menachos require agasha and you're excluding the 2 loaves and the lechem aponim? So he explains, Marbani shar menachos sheish men leishim. I'll include the other menachos that they're also burnt. The lechem are never go on the altar. There's nothing burnt from them, so therefore they don't require agasha. Gemara says, but the whole mincha of the nesachim, which is the flour offering that accompanies an animal, is entirely burnt. Yachol yetun agasha. I might think on this logic that it should require agasha. Tamalomar v'hikriva. So it says in the pasuk, Ve'kriva, which teaches us these and not another one. And it says, Minchas Nesachem. Mar says, Va'afikte, but didn't Rabbi Shimon already use the word Ve'kriva to teach us that the Mincha of the Sota requires Agasha? Well, no, Ve'kriva. It could have said Ve'kriv, but it says Ve'kriva. The extra A is teaching us Minchas Nesachim does not get Hagasha. Marisa Rabo Shar Menachos Uoti Minchas Nesachim. Why do all the other Menachos require Hagasha and not the Mincha of Nesachim? Or on top of Samachal of Menachos. Marba Ani Shar Menachos Shabos Begal Atzman. Motze Ani Minchas Nesachim She'ena Ba Begal She'ena Ba Begal Atzman. I include the other Menachos because they come on their own, but not the Nesachim, which doesn't come on its own. So according to Rabbi Shimon, he says Minchas Kohen Mashiach do not get Agasha. But why? They come on their own. So the pasuk says Vihi Gisha, which implies that's excluding Minchas Kohen, a Mashiach, and the Minchas of the Kohanim. The Gemara says no. But doesn't this require that we need Vigisha to teach us the din of Agasha, not to exclude the Mincha of the Kohanim? Gemara says no, min vehegish Vigisha. It could have said Vegish instead of said Vigisha. Why are you excluding the Minchas Kohanim, Minchas Kohanim Mashiach, but you're including the other Menachos and Agasha? I'm including the other Menachos because they are burnt, and they also come on their own. And also the Kohanim get to eat from them. And I'll exclude the 2 loaves of bread and lechem apanim, that nothing is burnt. And the Minchas Nesachim she'ein ba begal atzma. The Minchas Nesachim is different because it doesn't come on its own. Minchas Kohanim and Minchas Kohanim Mashiach she'ein ben leKohanim. And the Minchas of the Kohanim and Minchas Kohanim Mashiach, I'm excluding those because none of it gets to be eaten by the Kohanim. It's entirely burnt. Veirim, and then it says in the pasuk with respect to the Kmitza that the Kohen does the Kmitza Yachol B'Kli. This kind of is really, I'm not sure why this is here at all. But anyway, it's like a coda. Veirim Yachol B'Kli. I might think the Kmitza has to be done in a utensil. Tamlomar ve'irimi menu bikumtso. Ma rama amor lalam bikumtso. Afa rama amor kan bikumtso. It means to say that it doesn't need a utensil to pour the mincha onto the fire. We had a discussion about this actually back. I think it was Yud Beis. I don't remember exactly. Maybe Yud Tes. On Yud and Beis, we had discussion about whether or not the Kmitza needs to be done in a utensil or thrown onto the fire with your hands. The Gemara is a little bit vague about it. It's not explicit, but here the Gemara is saying it does not require a utensil for pouring the Kmitza. Well, here it's not really talking about the pouring on the fire. Here it's just talking about the arama, which should be done with your hands and not with utensil. That's not talking about putting it on the fire. It's just talking about lifting it up. Okay, this is today's daf. Baruch Hashem. We'll stop here. Baruch Hashem.